Hi folks, and welcome to episode 26 of the Epochs of the Lotus Eaters. I'm joined by Bo, and this week we're going to be talking about the sad end of the 100 Years' War, so F in the chat, as it were. But yes, we'll be talking about why the 100 Years' War came to a close and how it happened. And I suppose we will have to begin by describing what happened at Orléans.
Yes, well, that is quite often given as sort of the turning point.
Yes.
And as we discussed in the last one, it's kind of true, but just it's not perfectly true.
No.
But something I wanted to say is, at what point can you say that? So, for example, sort of maybe an obvious example is, at what point did the Germans lose World War II?
Well,
lots of people say, oh, it was Stalingrad,
yeah.
but then you could say, well, it was when they invaded Russia at all. Or then you could say it was when Hitler declared war on the Americans. Well, but then you could say it's when he started submarine warfare against the Americans. So you can always argue.
Well, this actually leads us into sort of a larger point about categorization and vague ideas. Some things just don't admit of a definite barrier. And so essentially we just arbitrarily say, well, for a sort of mnemonic's sake, for our ease of understanding it and remembering it, we choose something that seems to be a memorable and important event. And so there's nothing wrong with us doing that, to be honest. And when people start like nitpicking, but but here, and it's like, yeah, maybe, but the whole thing was kind of arbitrary anyway. We were just choosing a point that we found easy to remember. So don't worry about it so much, is the way I look at it. It's, as long as we're giving a sort of accurate retelling of events, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, no, fair enough. That's what I think. I mean, all of history is a narrative, isn't it? And so it's all stories, really, without sort of doing it too much for an injustice. And so you're always going to be.
What's wrong with it just being stories? Like our entire lives are stories, really.
Well, true. But it's that interplay between fact and fiction.
Yeah.
And the job of the serious historian is to minimise the fiction as much as possible.
Sure, but
that's all I mean, really.
But the counter punch to that will be, well, anything that you mention excludes other things that you don't mention.
Right.
And it was the fact that you focused on that thing elevated the importance of it above other things that someone else might find important. And so you end up in a kind of, never ending cycle of self-justification against things that you just didn't find interesting, whereas someone else did. And it's like, okay, well, look, if you care that much about that other thing, you tell that story. Go ahead, no one's stopping you. But this is the one we're telling. And, unfortunately, the English lose. So. Anyway, right, so yes.
Yes, so this story really is sort of a long, drawn-out defeat for the English. There's no sort of Verdun moment, Dunkirk moment, where we're sort of on the beaches trying to get away, or there's no sort of massive reverse version of Agincourt or anything. So it does sort of sputter and peter out a bit. There are battles that punctuate it, which we'll get into.
Yeah, and I noticed that I was doing a bit of just watching YouTube videos, because honestly, I'd forgotten in the years since I've read about this exactly how this ended, because it's not climactic. It doesn't admit of a kind of heroic narrative, and people forget that Joan of Arc wasn't there at the end of the war. She gets executed by the English, so it's like, okay, we may have lost, but she didn't win, but the whole thing, it's not narratively satisfying.
Yes.
Is it? You want like a Sauron style defeat or something like that if it's going to be a good story. But real life doesn't work that way.
Yeah, unfortunately, real life isn't very cinematic most of the time, is it? No. So just before we get onto the siege of Orleans, I've decided I'm going to call it Orleans.
Are we going Orleans now?
Yeah.
Is it because we're losing now? It's like, no, it's Orleans. It's Joan of Arc, not d'Arc.
Yeah, Jeanne d'Arc. We're just going to call her Joan. Yeah, Joan of Arc, that's fine. Yeah. So just before we get into that, because we ended the last epochs pretty much as that siege was just about to start. Before that, I'd like to read a quick paragraph from historian Nicholas Vincent, which just gives a bit of colour to something I didn't really touch upon last time. We talked all about how Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was sort of regent in England, but we didn't really, and the council, this council of Regency Council, sort of the internal strife in all of that, and the details of the politics, because it does become really important because we end up sort of fighting each other. Well, to cut to the chase, the 100 Years' War ends and the Wars of the Roses start. In fact, you can argue, some do, that they kind of overlap or start to overlap.
And there's obviously some sort of causal continuity between them as well. Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, like they're the same figures are involved in it. Like Richard, Duke of York, who people might know is, would have been the head of the Yorkist faction, but he dies in the Battle of Wakefield, I believe. And anyway, it's his sons that become Edward IV and the Duke of Clarence that is drowned in wine, and the youngest one, Richard III. So all of that is the next generation.
And instead of having a civil war in England, they should have been in unity and prosecuting the war in France.
Might have been better. Yeah.
Anyway.
But this quick paragraph from Nicholas Vincent, he says, quote, like Richard I, Henry V had spent the majority of his reign in foreign adventures, leaving England in the hands of regents and ministers. Whilst he lived, this council had governed effectively, far better indeed than had been the case with the council left to govern England during Richard I's crusade. Nonetheless, like Henry IV before him, Henry V had depended heavily upon his own Lancastrian family to prop up his regime. With his death, the tensions within this family for the first time began to spill over into open competition. Those who praise family values, such as yourself, should remember that families can prove not only supportive and benevolent institutions, but destructive and bitterly divisive. The reasons for the breakdown in Lancastrian harmony are clear enough. Henry left no written instructions for the government of either England or France after his death. Instead, it was taken for granted that his son, the young Henry VI, would be cared for by his uncles, Henry V's brothers, John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. They in turn would govern with the assistance of their Beaufort kinsmen, Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, and Thomas Beaufort, Duke of Exeter. Bedford took charge of France. Gloucester and Henry Beaufort were left to squabble over who should have the greater say in England. The outcome was confusion, self-serving malice, and a series of disputes within the council fit to rival any of those which had split the councillors of Richard I in the 1190s, end quote. So it's quite long there, but it says quite a lot. You've got quite a lot there. And this really, everything I've said there is really the seeds of what makes us so sort of weak in the last portion of the 100 Years' War. Is that we end up, there's dynastic struggles in England.
Riven with division, the mafia politics are now facing a huge power vacuum in the absence of Henry V.
Yeah.
And the failure of Henry not the failure, but the inability of Henry VI to assert any kind of power. And so it's up for grabs, and so they do.
Yeah. Someone I was reading just earlier today described the royal family tree as just way too big, really, way too big to be sort of practicable. There's far too many people with good claims, and that's what the Wars of the Roses is about. The Wars of the Roses are often called the Cousins' War, because just different cousins all fighting each other. But we won't get into that in this story. But it all really starts here because they start sort of killing each other before the 100 Years' War is even over.
The French must have been thrilled.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You can imagine. They're like, oh, finally.
Yeah.
Like,
some division in England after 100 years of fighting. It only took this long.
We've had civil war for ages. The French, we've had civil war for ages. Now they can have a taste. So the siege of Orleans. One thing is the figure of Joan of Arc, like you say, she's really important, but her story is actually very short.
It is.
It's only sort of a few years long that she's sort of on the stage of history.
3 years or something, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's very, very short, and
she's very young.
It's weird the kind of importance that's ascribed to her, because all she really seems to do is provide morale.
Well, you say all, but that's a big deal.
I mean, I
suppose,
I shouldn't underplay that. You know,
but you're right.
But it's just a morale-raising figure for the French, and I suppose that is massively important now that I've said it like that. So I take that back. It's not only, but it's just interesting how that's where the boost to morale had to come from.
Yeah. This 17-year-old illiterate peasant girl
who presumably, assuming any of her claims of, like divine visions and things like that, so she's got mental problems, I would say.
You cannot, some people,
As an atheist, I'd be like, right, okay, so she's a bit delusional then, saying God's speaking to her, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to view her, either mad, completely mad, people hearing voices in their head, like a schizophrenic or something like that, I don't know, or that there was nothing clinically wrong with her, chemically wrong with her mind, but she was just she was a woman of her time and genuinely believed all the voices. Well, she was actually hearing voices and she believed them, or It's all made up, and you can take the cynical view, and it's all just a silly game.
Well, I wouldn't take the cynical view. I definitely don't think that's the case.
I think she believed what she said mostly.
Absolutely.
That's my opinion.
I agree. And again, it comes from our very different modern paradigm where we're materialist and atheists and we don't believe that people believed. Whereas in medieval France, there were lots, especially in medieval France, actually, there was a particular sort of view that women had a special pious connection to God. And there were lots of these women prophets running around prophesying and saying that God says this, God says that. And so Joan of Arc just comes from a long tradition of this and is not unusual in any way, shape or form. And I think they believed it. This is genuinely their worldview. In the same way that people think that science or believe in science now, they genuinely believed in the Bible and in the church, in the Christian teachings, and in the idea of a God that intercedes in reality. They believe that. And so anything that happens to them, they'll interpret through that lens. So even if it is that she's got some sort of mental disorder or something, well, okay, but what we call a mental disorder, they call an intercession from God. So there we go. So I don't think we should be cynical about it. I think that she wasn't false or a grifter or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because she seemed to take it really seriously, and she died for it. So it's a grift gone wrong, if that's a grift.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right to say there's sort of a long tradition of it. I mean, even I think there's an example in the age of Henry VIII, which is way after this, and there's I can't remember her name. There's an English version sort of, and she decrees that one of Henry's marriages won't last and he'll lose his throne. Same sort of thing, and she is sort of exposed by Thomas Cromwell. They depict it in the Wolf Hall. Anyway, it's good if you're interested in the age of Henry VIII. But some historians, Churchill goes, he seems to be kind of in love with Joan of Arc in some ways. Well, I'll put it this, it's way over the top. He says, quote, "Joan was a being so uplifted from the ordinary run of mankind that she finds no equal in 1,000 years."
Wow. I mean, he really thinks highly of her.
Yeah, another one. She embodied the natural goodness and valor of the human race, in unexampled perfection, unconquerable courage, infinite compassion, the virtue of the simple, the wisdom of the just shone forth in her.
I mean,
he doesn't talk about other people like that.
He doesn't, but he's not really wrong either. Because I mean, it's not like she wasn't committed. So let's talk about what she did, and then we'll talk about how she became Joan of Arc, the legendary figure, and then we'll talk about her sort of qualities and characteristics. Because from the reports that we have, that's not really wrong,
Yeah.
But I mean, how accurate these are.
She does really jump out.
Yeah.
I've got a paragraph here from Nicholas Vincent where he says the whole thing in relatively succinctly, and we can go back and pick it apart. But he says this, quote, "The chief turning point here, the Lancastrian Stalingrad, is generally reckoned to have occurred at Orleans in 1429. It involved an illiterate 17-year-old peasant girl from the far eastern frontiers of France, Joan of Arc, convinced that she had been called upon to restore the Dauphin, disinherited for the past 10 years, to his rightful position as king, and that she was acting as the mouthpiece for voices, including those of Saints Michael, Catherine and Margaret, who chose to speak through her. Joan sought out the Dauphin on the Loire. Whether genuinely convinced or merely keen to manipulate her for political ends, various figures at the Dauphin's court claimed to identify her as La Pucelle, or Maid, whose restoration of France had been prophesied since the 1390s. Joan not only brought a new messianic spirit to the French resistance at Orleans, from where the English were compelled to withdraw, but forced the Dauphin's hand, persuading him to lead a triumphal progress to Rheims. Rheims is where the French kings had always been crowned, not Paris.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. What I just read out there actually is loads more detail and takes place over a few different years. But that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Because I mean, at first, when she first goes to speak with the King of France, she's not allowed to see him, is she?
He treats her with disdain to begin with.
Who are you? You're just some peasant girl. Piss off. We're fighting a war here. But
sorry, who even let you in the room?
Yeah, exactly. Why am I speaking to you? But then she goes home and is supposed to be married, but refuses because she's got to remain a virgin. And so, she's pious and protects her chastity and things like this. And then she ends up coming back, doesn't she?
Yes, she ends with the stories go that they basically say, because it's not a new thing. A woman like this, they're like, okay, well, prove yourself by tell us something that only you could have heard from God. And apparently she does, and they're like, oh, wait, what? How is this? So there's some stories. We, as a modern, we assume it's
tells them what they want
made up. Yeah. But they said describe, one of the stories is describe this particular ceremonial sword that we all know about, but there's no way you as a peasant girl could possibly have ever seen it. And apparently she describes it in minute detail, and they're all a bit sort of taken aback by that. How could that be?
I mean, what's she like? God, you got to tell me about this sword.
Yeah. Maybe look, well, that's the thing, because you don't know, do you? She could have had intelligence. Someone said they're going to ask you about this sword. This is what it looks like.
Absolutely, could all have been
basically.
Exactly. Someone on the inside could have coached her. We don't know.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.